Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. So excited to see you here. I can't see you. You get the idea. Excuse me. I'm here to introduce David Greenham, who's been involved in community arts and theater in Maine for more than 40 years. And I know what you're thinking. He does not look old enough for that to be true. He spent 14 years as the producing artistic director of the theater at Monmouth. So you probably have seen one of his shows. If you're not familiar with the theater at Monmouth, it's the Shakespearean Theater of Maine. And I recently had the opportunity to hear David give a presentation about Shakespeare for Midcoast Senior College in Brunswick. And the presentation is called The Zany Majestic Bard. And I came away with a new appreciation for Shakespeare. Truly, if you have the opportunity to hear David give that presentation, I really recommend it. You will learn a lot. So in addition to lecturing on drama and theater at the University of Maine at Augusta, David has also been the Associate Director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, as well as the interim Executive Director of the Maine Arts Commission. He now works as a writer and a consultant. And what, you may ask, does any of this have to do with German prisoners of war in Maine during World War II? Well, David is also the founder and creator of Maine History Theater of Ideas, which combines history, research, and presentation to share stories about Maine and stories of interest to Mainers. So this is one of those, and it's wonderful. Thank you for bringing this story to us, David. And I pass it off to you, David Greenham. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Let me share my screen here. Well, I guess it's working. Okay. And if it's okay with you, you will jump right in. At Christmas time in 1945, a handmade certificate was given to logger Lewis Brown of Grand Lake Stream. And it read, "In memory of the German prisoners of war who worked with you in the woods around Grand Lake Stream in 1944 and 1945, they will always gratefully remember your kindness, helpfulness, and the fair treatment you accorded them." It was signed by 29 men. They were just a few of the several hundred German POWs who spent the end of World War II in Washington County, Maine. They were housed in the former Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Indian Township. It seems like few people remember this history of this time in Maine. And in addition, German POWs were over at Somerset County, at Sabumic Lake, in Holton, right up by the old Air Force Base, and in Spencer Lake, just south of Jackman. In fact, by the end of 1946, when the camps were closed, more than 4,000 mostly German POWs had been the guests of the United States and the state of Maine. There were also POWs at Camp Keys in Augusta, Dow Field in Bangor, and during the harvest season in tents at the Presque Isle Air Base. Now, when you think about the political climate today towards our enemies or our perceived enemies, it's kind of remarkable to think that nearly 80 years ago, our state welcomed 4,000 Nazi soldiers while we were still at war with the Nazis. So, how did this happen? Well, the story of Maine's POW camps really begins on November 8, 1942, with a military offensive that was known at the time as Operation Torch. The Allies, primarily American, British, and French troops, landed in Algeria and Morocco with a goal of advancing to Tunis, 800 kilometers, about 500 miles to the east. The goal of Operation Torch was to corner the famed Nazi African Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel. To some, Rommel remains the smartest of the Nazi field generals. When the attack occurred, it didn't take long for Rommel to realize the Nazis were in trouble, and he asked for more support to come through Italy, but he was told none would be coming. So by March, he traveled to Berlin to personally apprise Hitler of the situation and request more troops. Hitler ignored Rommel's request and instead reassigned Rommel to oversee the coast of Greece. And on May 12, 1943, all of the Axis forces in North Africa, 240,000 Italians and Germans, including most of the African Corps, surrendered simultaneously. So the story of Maine's POWs began with Operation Torch because the campaign ended with the Allies suddenly having to accommodate nearly 250,000 prisoners of war. And here's the question. What does an army do with 240,000 surrendered soldiers? The first issue, of course, is where do you put them? In World War II, North Africa and much of Europe was a battlefield, and the residents who had survived had their hands full with their own refugees and rebuilding. They couldn't also take on the necessary care and feeding of POWs, but they had to be cared for. The Geneva Convention, a treaty that came after World War I, was fairly clear on the care of prisoners of war. Although a commission was set up to determine exactly what the parameters were, the basic rule was that prisoners could not be forced to contribute directly to the war effort. Now, the key word there being directly. But more importantly, the Allies felt very strongly that anything but fair treatment to German prisoners would result in retaliation against Allied POWs held in Germany. It was tough for the Allies to continue to fight the war, but also build the infrastructure necessary to house the prisoners. Now, at around the same time, it turns out that in Maine and some other, especially northern border states where paper companies were located, began to have a conversation between paper executives and a group of powerful politicians. And they had started this conversation about 6 months before the surrender of North Africa. And one of these powerful politicians was Ralph Owen Brewster of Dexter, Maine, a former governor and, by the way, an early supporter of Maine's Ku Klux Klan. Brewster had been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1934. And following the election of 1940, he'd led a Republican sweep and moved on to the U.S. Senate in January of 1941. As you can imagine, several of Maine's industries relied heavily on having workers in the woods to harvest lumber for pulp and paper mills. As the war progressed, the supply of men from Maine and Canada who had traditionally worked in the woods had been severely depleted. By the first part of the 1943 harvest season, Maine's wood industries knew they were in trouble. In January of 1944, Ava Batchelder, a reporter for the Waterville Sentinel, wrote what is believed to be the first account of a challenge in the North Maine woods. In the 1942-1943 harvest season, production totaled 40 million cord of wood. A year later, production totaled just 20 million cord of wood. Now, it doesn't make much difference what you're making, but a 50% drop in 1 year is devastating. The drop in lumber affected the pulp mills like Great Northern and International Paper, Maine Seaboard in Bucksport, Kennebec Paper in Augusta, St. Croix Paper in Woodland, and S.D. Warren, Hollingsworth and Whitney, also in Woodland, and the Brown Paper Company in New Hampshire. Of particular need was yellow birch, which was being cut by the Allen Quimby Veneer Mill over in Bingham, and that was used for building airplanes. The situation in the fields wasn't much better. There was no one to pick crops, and the government tried to solve this problem with recruitment. They created something called the U.S. Crop Corps to get men and women to work on farms. But it didn't really work out so well because most of the able-bodied adults had jobs or weren't in a position to move to a farm and become a farmhand. So they tried to recruit teenagers to come in and help out, but they didn't have enough supervision to ensure that they wouldn't, do more than pick crops, if you know what I mean. In Maine, they tried just to do it with the boys as volunteers. Well, it turns out even without girls around, the boys weren't so great at keeping their focus on the job. But in Maine, we're pretty ornery. So we also went so far as to try to encourage tourists to spend part of their vacation picking crops. But that didn't really work anyway, either. So within the military, there had already been talk about the potential for POWs to come to the States, and that had been since about September of 1942. In fact, the Army had identified existing military posts in 18 states where there could potentially house as many as 50,000 POWs if the need arose. So by the time Senator Brewster and others started pressing Washington about the need for extra labor, the Army actually already had a plan. And it was true, the prisoners couldn't build tanks or planes or bombs, but they sure could cut lumber or build roads or plow fields or pick vegetables. Suddenly, a clear plan of working together fell into place, and the Army could figure out how to house its growing number of POWs, and the politicians and the industrial leaders and agricultural leaders could find a solution to the labor shortage. But the planners knew that there might be a conflict. For nearly 4 years, our nation had been fixated on destroying Hitler and the Third Reich. People were taught to be afraid of Germany and Japan. Newspapers were filled each day with stories of boys losing their lives in places people had never heard of. What's more, organized campaigns of buying war bonds and rationing had become the norm on the home front. Everyone had sacrificed to win the war. And why did they all sacrifice? To keep the enemy away from our wives and children. Now here was a plan to bring the enemy right in our own backyard. The planners knew that a marketing campaign would be necessary. Turns out here in Maine, we had the perfect person to sell the plan to the people of our state. In 1937, former Somerset County Sheriff Clyde Smith was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In the spring of 1940, he suffered a massive heart attack and died while he was in Washington. When a successor was needed, the Maine Republican Party didn't need to look very far for someone to finish out his term. It turns out that the Republicans elected Clyde Smith's secretary, who was his wife, Margaret Chase Smith. They had met when she wrote for a weekly newspaper in Skowhegan, the Independent Reporter, which was owned by Clyde Smith. And despite the fact that he was 21 years older than her, they fell in love and they were married in 1930. Clyde Smith had served nearly a decade in the state Senate. And while he was in the state Senate, his arch nemesis in those years was then State Senator Ralph Owen Brewster of Dexter. And Smith hated Brewster because of his support for the anti-Catholic Ku Klux Klan in Maine. But Margaret Chase Smith was no slouch. In the years after their marriage, she was elected to the Maine State Republican Board and was very, very well known in the party. And so even though she became the first woman to represent Maine in the United States Congress, her election at that time, the selection of her at that time, really made sense. She could finish out her husband's term while the party decided what they would do next. Well, they decided, of course. And what that was to figure out that Margaret Chase Smith was a natural leader, and she rose to become arguably Maine's most famous and beloved politician. Now, if you're related to Ed Muskie or George Mitchell, I apologize. Given their past history, I'm sure it wasn't easy for Senator Brewster to realize in 1944 that he should rely on the junior representative from his state to give Maine the news that the Germans were coming. But they both were very smart politicians. And so it was up to Representative Margaret Chase Smith to spread the news to Mainers. And Representative Smith did her part in the project, and the press release announcing the decision to place POWs in Maine, in the Maine woods, came from her office. The plan was received warmly, of course, by business leaders who were in on the plan, and they were in desperate need of assistance. The first prisoners in Maine would be flown into Camp Keys in Augusta, processed, and then delivered to the former Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC camp near Princeton. The camp was located in Indian Township. In CCC terms, it was known as the Far East Camp. The Civilian Conservation Corps was part of Roosevelt's New Deal. In Maine, as many as 100,000 jobs were created in the mid-1930s, building roads and schools and all kinds of important additions and improvements to Maine's infrastructure. I suspect the most famous of the CCC projects that we all know about are probably the wonderful carriage trails and bridges in Acadia National Park. So on May 1st or May 8th, 1944, there's a little bit of a discrepancy about the actual date. A small convoy rode up Route 1 and delivered 245 POWs, mostly quite young, ages 14 to 20, along with their armed guards, to Princeton, and then they all marched across the bridge to the camp at Indian Township. Aside from the fence and the guard towers, the old Far East camp was just about the same as it was when it was used by the CCC. The camp at Seboomick opened soon after, and eventually POWs were in the woods working. So that actually made a big difference in the labor shortage in the woods. But by midsummer, the issue of the harvest in the fields was coming around, and the prospects were not good. When the pea crop was ready, some Jamaicans arrived, but there weren't enough of them, and honestly, because they were Black, a lot of people seemed to have a problem with that. So the government said, okay, well, tell us what you need. The farmers said they needed hundreds more men, and their recommendation was that the War Office provide furloughs to soldiers in the who were from the county, from Augusta County, to come back and pick potatoes and other crops. Obviously, the government wasn't going to do that. So the government provided an alternative. Now, a lot of people knew it would come to this. And in fact, in Holton, in March of 1944, before the first POW even arrived in Maine, there was one group who had been ready for this to happen and had already plainly stated their opposition. And this group was the Holton Grangers. The Grange officers who are seen here had lots of concerns about these Nazi boys coming to Maine. They got a respected past master of the Grange, a guy named Albert Merritt, to sign an opposition letter that he wrote to Brewster. And Merritt, in his letter, wrote, "The Holton Grange at a regular meeting held on March 11th, 1944, unanimously ran on record as opposed to the sending of German prisoners of war to the Holton Air Base for use in the woods or on farms for the following reasons." And then they went ahead and said what those reasons were. They said the Holton Air Force Base was a terrible place for POWs to come because it was so close to Canada, and that POWs would escape to Canada, and then Holton and the U.S. would be blamed and there'd be an international incident. They also said because it's obvious there weren't enough soldiers around to pick the crops, there wouldn't be enough soldiers around to guard the prisoners, and so there'd be all kinds of chaos. And since there weren't enough guards around, all the prisoners would escape, and people in Holton would be, in constant state of danger. This is all, they were very concerned about all of this. So they also felt like they were going to sabotage the war effort by burning down the airport or setting fires to trees or poisoning wells. And also because they were foreigners, they didn't speak any English. And they also had an interesting belief that all of the German POWs came from cities and they didn't know anything about a farm life. But of course, We know that there was a lot of rural life in Germany and everywhere else. And then there was this issue of hours. Under the Geneva Convention, they were only allowed to work 48 hours a week. And they said a typical farmhand works sun up to sundown, about 70 hours a week. And if they're in the woods, when the weather's right, they work about 80 hours a week. And so they knew the prisoners wouldn't be allowed to work that long. So it was quite a controversy. And then shortly, the Holton Pioneer Times, the newspaper of record in Holton, wrote their own editorial on the issue. It's true, they said, that having POWs in our midst wouldn't be ideal. We saw it as a choice. They saw it as a choice between having the POWs or having the Jamaicans or letting the things rot in the fields. And so they clearly wrote, as we see it from our observations during the past week, and of course we could be wrong, the question pretty much resolves itself into a decision of whether we are going to have labor under guard, labor against which the community would have no protection during non-working hours, or no labor at all and suffer the consequences. In the end, of course, the prisoners came. The people really didn't have much of a choice, I suspect, if they didn't want their crops to rot in the fields. And in fact, once the camp opened at Holton and the other camp opened in Western Maine at Spencer Lake, it seems that people in nearby communities began to feel a sense of pride about having these soldiers in their communities. There was some novelty, of course, because they could sometimes hear them singing, or they might get a glimpse of them as they were driving by in trucks. But the other reason that there was some hope was that suddenly there were trucks with logs driving on the roads again, and the crops were being picked and were coming to market. So it was very, very helpful. And for many of the POWs, it seems, the hard work without the daily threat of being killed was very welcome. The biggest shock of all, it seems, was for people to find out that for the most part, these were just normal men and boys caught up in something that was way bigger than them. And for their part, they learned that these people in rural Maine were just regular people. The POWs sort of fell into three categories, and this was for POWs wherever they ended up. There were some hardcore Nazis, and they generally stuck together, and most of them were rooted out before they were sent to any of these POW camps, and they were sent to more high security prison camps. In a way, it's not surprising that there weren't more of these Nazis, because as you know, the Nazi propaganda machine was very successful and all-encompassing. In Germany, the Nuremberg laws had been created in 1935. They eliminated the rights and citizenship of Jews, homosexuals, convicted criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, the mentally ill, disabled, and anyone who opposed the Nazi Party. Membership in the Hitler Youth was compulsory for every boy and girl beginning at age 10 and older. So in 1944, a 20-year-old German boy had been force-fed Nazi propaganda for half of his life. To keep troops inspired, the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, regularly reminded the Germans that the Nazis were on the side of righteousness. He says, "We Germans are not the sort of people who beg for mercy from an enemy who is out to destroy us. We know there is only one effective answer to British-American bombing terror, and that's counter-terror." He told these soldiers, he told everybody, that the enemy was hiding in bunkers and living in fear. In 1944, that was true in a lot of German cities. And of course, it was also true in Britain. But in 1944 in the United States, the war effort did not keep life from continuing. In fact, US cities were bustling because there was plenty of work to do, and there wasn't a lot to spend money on, but movies were very, very popular, and people were trying to go out and do things to keep their minds off the war. So the when these German POWs arrived in ships in New York and Boston, the government did something that was really smart, which was they loaded them on buses and they drove them right through Times Square and right along Massachusetts Avenue in Boston, so that they would see that the cities in the United States were actually doing okay. And so the second group of Nazis, prisoners of war, were generally this group of soldiers who were people who were very much focused on the Nazi propaganda, but then had realized when they got here that they had been duped by what they've heard, because what they saw was something completely different. But there was a third group, and according to most accounts, it was the largest group of soldiers that were in the camp. And they were guys who didn't care much one way or the other. They would have preferred greatly not to have been in the war at all, and spent most of their time with their heads down and doing what they were told to do so that they had the best chance to survive. And being a POW in America meant you were safe and warm and fed and cared for. In letters people wrote, many of them seemed to see it as an adventure. Now here's another shot of some soldiers with a rustic farmer who they probably called Mother. And you don't find it written down anywhere, but most of the former POWs shared stories that they were told about the consequences of escaping. If they escaped, they were going to die in the woods, or worse yet, they were going to get caught and their papers were going to be stamped that they should be sent to Russia. And they all knew that nobody wanted to go to Russia. Now, neither of these options were appealing, so most of them stayed put. However, there were some escapes. I think a number of them sort of seemed like they were like this one. Two guys escaped. They turned their clothes inside out to hide the PW that had been printed on their shirts and pants. And they were seen along Route 1 by a school bus driver. And he stopped his bus and he asked them if they had come from the prison camp. And they both answered with the only English words they knew. One said yes and the other said no. So the bus driver said, well, get on the bus. And he drove them over to a friend's house, a mechanic's house, and asked him to watch them. And then he drove the bus into town to get the police. And then they all went back to the mechanic's place and they took him back to the camp and said, hey, you lost a couple of guys. And that was the end. There was another escape over in Indian Township, which lasted 2 weeks. It was quite exciting. First, the guys escaped. There were 6 of them altogether. 2 had escaped from a work site near Crawford, which, if you know Maine, is along the airline road, Route 9. And the other 4 had escaped from Topsfield, which is on Route 1 north of the airline. Even today, there's really not much in Topsfield. So a couple of days later, it was reported that there had been several leads, but they hadn't found anybody. However, they did pick up 2 hitchhikers who kind of looked like they could be soldiers. And in fact, it turns out they weren't German soldiers, but they were 2 Canadian soldiers who jumped ship in New York and were trying to find their way back to Canada. And as you can imagine, the authorities gave them a free ride back to Canada, and they probably weren't too happy about that. A day or 2 later, they were all still free, and the search was broadening. About a week after the escape, 2 of them were caught, the 2 that were from Crawford on the airline road. And apparently, they stumbled upon a cabin that had a lot of food in it and was pretty well stocked. They broke into the cabin, and they had pretty much decided that they would spend the rest of the war there because they had enough food. While they were figuring out how to ration all that food and stuff, the game wardens who had been looking for them came back to the cabin because that's where they were staying when they were searching for these guys. And so they obviously were caught. The next day, another guy was caught by some hunters who were up near Lincoln, and they had seen some strange looking guys cross some railroad tracks. They staked it out, and when someone came out of the woods, they captured him. And finally, a day later, the rest of them were caught. They had traveled about 40 miles north, but finally decided the only way out was to hop a train. So they were on the tracks looking for that opportunity. As it turns out, they were captured on Laundry Day. So when the authorities arrived, they were there standing in their underwear while their clothes were all hanging on branches around there to dry. The most well-recorded escape came in Western Maine. 3 men at the Spencer Lake camp in Western Maine created some snowshoes out of barrel staves and some wire and were headed out into the snowy woods. And this is a pair of the snowshoes that is in the collection of the Maine State Museum. A second pair of the snowshoes still exists as well, and it's in the Maine Wildlife Park in Gray, where the Warden Service has a museum. So the 3 guys, Anton Gelb, Franz Keller, and Horst Schuler, were on an ice cutting detail when they snuck away. Wardens tracked them for 4 days, and the wardens knew the woods out there, and they were sure that the POWs would escape and follow the water and eventually head to the forks. But they were really concerned about the fact that they might die on the way or they might freeze. So they had somebody on a snowmobile slowly following the escapees while they headed north towards the confluence of the Dead River and the Kennebec River up in the forks. And sure enough, they were captured in an abandoned river driver's shack on a knoll overlooking the forks. Although the Somerset County Sheriff's, State Police, Maine Warden Service, and even the FBI were involved in the manhunt, there was this sense that they were mostly amused by the stunt, so long as the soldiers didn't freeze to death or something or drown in the river. This is actually one of my favorite photos that I found in doing this whole project. It's one of the game wardens who captured the guys, and I love the smirk on his face. And actually, I've done this a lot of different times, this presentation, and at one point I met his daughter, who told me that he always, for the rest of his life, talked about this whole episode. For the most part, though, things at camp went along as planned. Wood got cut, crops got picked, and men mostly stayed out of trouble. The camps thrived for 2 years. During that time, more than 4,000 POWs came to Maine. You know, it's hard to believe. But no one ever lost track of the reasons the soldiers were here in Maine, and of course, the toll that World War II took on everyone. As the war ended, some of the camps chose to do something that turned out to be a little controversial, but they showed what were called the atrocity films. There were several that were put out by the War Department. The films are nearly unedited footage of concentration camps. That's what the men in this picture are watching. There's no direct report that I could find of the film being shown specifically in the Maine camps, but it's quite likely that one was shown in Holton, at least, because that's where the most prisoners were. If you've never seen one of these films and they're available online, you would never forget the images. Seboomic and Spencer Lake averaged between 250 and 300 men until they closed in March of 1946. This is actually a marker at the Spencer Lake camp that was placed by a group of 8th graders from the Forest Hill School up in Jackman, who also did a lot of digging around there and found a lot of artifacts that are in the Jackman Historical Society. The Indian Township camp peaked in October of 1944 with 322 men. At some point between September and December of 1945, the camp was closed down, and this pair of stone posts are the only remaining elements of that camp. The largest of the camps was Holton, which at its peak in early 1946 had a little over 1,600 men. The final prisoners left Maine from the Holton camp in May of 1946, just 2 years after those first trucks rolled up Route 1 to Princeton. This is a stone that was placed by some former prisoners and community members in Holton when they came for a visit in 2003. It wasn't long before we were left with just the stories. The camps were closed quickly and the buildings were liquidated. So barracks were generally cut in half and sold to people to be used in whatever way they wanted to. There's folks up there who say that the buildings dot the Maine woods because people are using. Here actually are two pictures of former barracks, or half of a former barrack. One is in Holton and one is in Princeton. And if you take the dormers off of each of these buildings, you can see the length of what would be a half of a barrack. Those around at the time also recall that there were several different forms of entertainment provided for the soldiers. Sometimes dances were held and people could hear the music playing. And certainly after VE Day, the Victory in Europe Day on Friday, March 8th in 1945, things loosened up considerably. But the POWs were still POWs, so they couldn't go out and go wherever they wanted to do. The Army was responsible for them, or the U.S. government was responsible for them and their well-being until the day they turned them over. They also had to keep them really busy. So yes, they could only work 48 hours a week, but they had to be there every day and night. And so they had all kinds of programs for them. And one of the ones that is quite well known, and there's a lot of work from, is the artwork. They had very strong art programs there in the camps all over the country. This is these are some pictures of art that exists in Maine that were made in the camps. If you'd like to see some, the historical societies in Jackman and the Historical Society in Holton both have wonderful examples in their collections. And I think the Greenville Historical Society has a few as well. But mostly we're left with stories and recollections. I'm happy in our conversation, if you're interested, I'm happy to share some stories that I've learned along the way from folks. But I'll end this program with one lovely story that reflects the connections that were made at the time. This is Kay Bell. And some of the best connections were made with the POW teams that worked on the farms during the harvest seasons. Kay Bell, pictured here in 2010, was in her mid-1920s when the POWs came to work at her family's potato farm. Her three brothers had enlisted and were already fighting overseas when the POWs arrived in Holton. The family took a group of 10 prisoners every day during the harvest season to pick potatoes. And she said she treated them especially well because they were around the same age as her brothers, and she hoped that if they were captured somewhere across the Atlantic, people would do the same for them. She often shared stories about how the POWs and the guards watched out for each other. One time, a guard had lost his rifle somewhere in the field, and the whole group spent about an hour looking for it. After the POWs left Holton, Bell's family and the other families received letters from the German boys reporting that their towns were destitute, and the community gathered together and sent care packages for their German friends. In 2003, a group of former POWs returned to Holton, and Kay Bell, who by then was the head of the Holton Historical Society and Art Museum, helped organize the event. And the memorial stone was placed just across the street from where the camp once stood. A few years later, Kay and a few others were invited to Germany, where she said we were treated like royalty. But most meaningfully to her, one of the former POWs drove Kay far north to the Baltic Sea city of Rostock. It's there where her brother Louis, who was a tail gunner on a B-17, had been shot down and was missing in action and presumed dead. Together, she and her German friend, a former POW, memorialized her brother on the shore of the sea where he was lost. Kay Bell passed away at the age of 95 in November 2016, but was a wonderful inspiration. So in 2012, I put together an exhibit about the POW camps for the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. Our exhibit, Maine Boys Overseas and German Boys in Maine, brought together for the first time artifacts and stories from the Jackman Moose River Historical Society, the Aroostook Historical Society and Art Museum, the Grand Lake Stream Historical Society, the Fogler Library up at University of Maine at Orono, the Maine State Museum, the National Archives, Northeast Historic Films, and from several historians and history writers. This is an interesting Maine story, of course, but it's also a story about human interaction. And to me, that's what is most important. We brought our enemy into our communities. We treated them fairly and with respect, and they, in kind, worked hard and appreciated us and respected us. It didn't change the horrors perpetrated by on humanity by the Third Reich and their allies. But it was proof, in a small way, that even if we profoundly disagree with people, we can find a way to coexist. So it was relevant in 2012 when I started doing this, and it turns out that's still relevant today. So I thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, David. This was very, very interesting. And I see we have a number of questions already waiting for you. Let's see. And I don't know if you can see on the screen, I'm seeing some applause and some heart
sweet.
reactions. So
Stop my share. There we go.
okay. The first question that I'm seeing here is, where else in the US were the Nazi POWs sent?
All but three states. And I don't remember. I know that Vermont was one of them, but I don't know what the other two were, but they weren't in New England.
And were they generally doing the same types of things?
Yeah. Oh yeah. There were like, in places like Texas and Iowa, there were like 20 camps. The fact that we're only a few here, it does turn out that the Maine camp and the New Hampshire and their camp in New Hampshire were actually the first two camps.
Oh,
But
interesting.
they did spread all over the place.
Okay.
And of course, I need to say, this is also the same time there were Japanese internment camps where Japanese Americans were interned, but they were not working camps.
I want to follow that up. I'm going to let Jody take the next question, but Paul has just asked a question that was going through my mind as I read the last question to you. Paul says, is it right to call these soldiers Nazis, to use that word Nazis? And that's
right to me to call them Nazis?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the idea that the Nazi Party was a party, and these people were indoctrinated into the Nazi Party, and so yes, they were Nazi soldiers. Yes, they were also Germans, but they were Nazi soldiers. And this comes from working at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center. Where I have a difficulty is when we call all Germans Nazis, because not all Germans were Nazis, and so that's why I tend to use Nazis when I'm talking about Nazi soldiers.
Okay.
But you should do whatever you think is best.
We had a couple of different people who want to know if any of the POWs decided to stay here or come back and settle here.
Well, it's a good question. They didn't have a choice about staying here. They would have been here illegally if they'd have stayed here, and the U.S. would have been accountable for them, which would be a difficult thing. So they all had to be returned. Yes, I've come across stories in other places where German citizens came back, who former POWs came back and lived, but I've not run into that in Maine.
David, there was a little, almost a little bit of humor when you talked about the escapees and the way that was way it was written about in the paper and the way the stories went. And I wonder if that is what led to this next question, but are there any other amusing or funny stories about the POWs while they were here?
Oh, there's so many funny and interesting stories. They made beer, and they figured out how to make beer in the camps. There's a picture in the Jackman the Spencer Lake camp. That stone is in front of a big oven, and apparently one of the guys in that camp was a baker, and he said that he would bake bread if they would give him the supplies. And he not only baked bread for the whole camp, but he also baked bread for the soldiers' families, and they often sent bread up to Jackman to people. There was that kind of stuff. Probably one of the most fun stories I have ever heard is guys were at a farm, and the guard was sleeping, and they saw some turkeys. And so one of the POWs instinctively picked up the rifle and shot a couple of turkeys. And of course, that scared the crap out of the sleeping guard. And he made them promise not to tell anybody. And then when they went the next week or whenever they went, the farm owner had created this wonderful turkey dinner. And so the neighbors came over, and the soldiers, all the POWs all had turkey dinner together. But it was all this apparently a big cover up, because the guard would have gotten in a lot of trouble for letting a POW use his rifle.
Okay. So David, you mentioned dances, and I wanted to know about that too. But somebody asked, did they dance with the local women? I don't know who else they would dance with unless it was each other, I suppose.
I think if you know the movie Stalag 17, I think it was more a situation like that, where they danced with each other and maybe they made wigs.
Okay.
Somebody did tell me a story at one point about their family this was like in Mississippi, maybe, or one of the southern states, and that her parents had owned a music store, and above the music store was a dance hall, and that they found out that there were a whole bunch of POWs down there who were musicians, were like real musicians. And so they were able to go to the music store at night and play the music, and people would stand outside listening to it because it was really good music. And so finally they arranged for a dance for the community. I don't think the other prisoners were able to go, but the musicians played for the community and they danced. But there was still a lot of it wasn't a free-for-all at all.
Okay. And that person also wanted to know if there were any connections that might have led to any marriages. Maybe they met someone they worked for and that happened afterward.
I've not come across that, but who knows?
Yeah. And this person has a lot of good questions.
Sure.
Was there ever German newspapers? And I think that must mean, did the prisoners write a newspaper?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this. So at the Fogler Library, which is the library up at the University of Maine at Orono, in the archives, they have the newspapers that were written from the Holton camp. They're all handwritten and hand drawn and hand colored, and they're beautiful. They're all, of course, in German. And to my knowledge, they're not translated. But I was able to get copies of them for the exhibit, and I had a German professor that I knew translate one, like somebody had written a poem or something, and I had them translate a poem. But probably the most beautiful artifacts I found are these hand-printed German newspapers from the Fogler Library.
Huh.
Because you have to remember, these guys did they were complete mix of professions. And so there were all kinds of guys. And in fact, with the guys working on the farms, there were some guys like I was told a story about a guy who was up in the Holton camp who was a master carpenter, and they don't think he ever picked a crop. That all he did was go around from farm to farm and fix doors and make repairs, because they didn't have that. Or a mechanic, if a mechanic was around, they did mechanical stuff. They didn't, so they were valuable in a lot of different ways.
That's really interesting. And when you talk about the newspapers, it sounds to me like that's a rich source for future research. So if anyone here wants to look into those and wants to come back and do a talk with us,
Someday there'll be a book. I've got so much.
Oh, okay.
information,
Oh,
but
you're still working on it. Okay.
I'm
I
not
take-
still working on it, but I ought to be. I have lots of information. So if somebody wants to take it and run with it a little bit, I'm happy to work with you.
It just sounds like there must be so much there. This is interesting too, because you mentioned the story about the turkey, but there's a question, did the prisoners do any hunting to supplement their food supply?
Oh yeah, what they got, especially the guys in the woods, what they were able to get, they could eat, they could prepare it, because it saved money for the government. Because the government was the one giving them food. I mean, they worked for script, but the script could only be bought for necessities and things that were in the canteen.
Okay. Well, this one's more of a comment than a question.
Mhm.
But this person has a short story. I worked with a German submariner who was a POW in Canada and always said that Nazis were the radical soldiers. So you kind of touched on that.
Yeah.
And so he's verifying for you.
And I will say, I believe that it's not in the piece, but I believe at the time that the Holton Grangers were all mad about the pre-POWs coming to Maine, one of their issues was that the POWs would escape and go into Canada and cause an international incident. But at the time, there were already German POWs in Canada, so it did happen.
All right, let's see. Oh, this is an interesting question. Do you know or think that the American POW soldiers in Germany were treated as well as these German POW soldiers in the US?
I don't think they were treated as well, but they were certainly treated better than the Japanese POWs, or the allies who were Japanese POWs were.
And somebody's wondering if they had translators.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
who to be a
It depended on it was who they could get, who they got. They didn't have I think they had translators at the processing centers. So in Massachusetts, when they arrived, there were translators, but I'm not sure that there were necessarily translators in in the camps all the time. Although if you've been to Europe, or, well, honestly, anywhere else in the world, everybody but Americans speak multiple languages. And so there were people, certainly in the cities, from the cities, who could speak English. So there was translation in the same way that if you go to a city where they don't speak English and you try to get your way around, there's always a way to figure it out.
Were any of them speaking French? Because I assume maybe some of the people in northern Maine might have spoken.
I suspect there were German. I suspect for sure there's Germans who speak French.
Well, speaking of translation, you actually have an offer here from a retired professor of German at Northwestern, who would be happy to help in translating. And I can
Let's go. Send me an email. We'll go up there. I would love that.
All right, cool. I'll make sure that the two of you have each other's contact.
I think they have them digitized, so I could send them to your professor and we could do that. That would be a blast.
And here's somebody who's saying that he and his father delivered horses to the POW in Spencer in the late 1944. It's always to hear people's stories who have a connection to these folks.
Yeah. I've heard several people who delivered horses. I met a guy in Holton who he used to drive he was probably 14 or so at the time, and he would drive the truck down to the camp to pick up his soldiers and guard. And he got there one day, and they said, well, you can have the soldiers, but we don't have a guard for you, so you have to be the guard for the day. And so he told the story about being a 14-year-old driving these prisoners up, and he had to pretend that he was the guard, and the prisoners all thought it was hilarious.
That's great. So David, returning to the prisoners who tried to escape, there's a question about whether anyone was shot. And it makes me wonder, were there any other, any other attempts to detain them from escape efforts?
Nobody was shot. There were some people injured on the, working in the woods, but they were taken care of. There were some deaths of POWs in other states, but there weren't any in Maine that I've come across.
I'm curious because I've seen a couple of children's books written about these stories. Were children kept completely away from these prisoners, or did they interact with them?
Well, not very many people interacted. The guy who mentioned that he and his dad delivered horses, they didn't interact a lot with them. It was pretty formal. Maybe they talked to one guy or something, but it were quick exchanges. There wasn't a lot of fraternization or whatever. So kids might have, when they were walking on the street in town and the truck went by with the guys, they might have waved or whatever, but there wasn't a lot of that. And then on the farms, they were pretty cautious about what was done, but there were certainly kids on the farm. I'm sure there were kids on farms who interacted with them a little bit. But I've not heard any stories about that.
There's a question here about doctors, and I'm not sure if the question is whether any of the prisoners were doctors or whether they had medical care, but I'm actually curious about both.
Both is true. They had medical care. There was a infirmary at the camps, and there were doctors at the camps and nurses or whatever. But I think it's more likely that there were POWs who were physicians.
Somebody's asking about their diet. Were they fed well?
This is part of the Geneva Convention issue, is that they have to eat as well. POWs have to eat as well as the soldiers do. And so they got good food. And in fact, one of the things that was funny about Brewster, I've come to think that Brewster was kind of a jerk, but obviously I didn't know him. But he was an egomaniac, and so he wanted credit for all of this. And so as soon as it was announced that it was happening and that passed, then Brewster sort of took all the credit for everything else that was going on. Well, it turned out that backfired on him, because in the trash from the camps, which of course went to the dump with everybody else's trash, they found things like boxes and wrappers from butter, when butter was really hard to get, or from other items that for everybody else was rationed, and that was part of the Geneva Convention. So there was quite an uproar about the fact that these guys ate better in some cases than people were eating at home and under rationing.
That is really interesting. Okay, there's a question here about, okay, there are some states that where Germans had settled, such as Pennsylvania or Ohio. And do you know if any German POWs were sent to those states?
What's funny is that we don't talk about it, but I learned this actually during the centennial of World War I, but that we talk about the internment camps of the Japanese for World War II. We never talk about the internment camps of the German Americans in World War I. but they had camps for German Americans. The were there camps in Pennsylvania Dutch country or in Minnesota and other places where there was big Wisconsin where there's big German populations? I don't know the answer to that. But I would think that Germans who were in America, by and large, would probably want to steer clear of making any connection to it all.
Were any of these men officers?
Oh yeah, some were, but there were officers' camps. There were the officers didn't work
Oh.
generally, weren't laboring. So it was mostly guys who were, not commissioned officers.
So what did they do with the officers?
They went to the officers' camp, whatever they do there. I don't know, but there were camps for officers. They still, rank still mattered in both the, in all prison camps, rank still matters.
Did any of the POWs in Maine work elsewhere, such as in the mills?
Not officially. But there are some stories, and in fact, I've heard stories that there were POWs at Camp Keys, which was an operating military site, that were in tents and were helping pick crops in like Litchfield and a little bit west of, I'm in Gardner, a little bit west of here, and that would have been illegal. That would, for them to be living on an active base. So I'm not sure, there's no evidence of that, but there's all kinds of things that you hear stories about, but there's no evidence. One of the great stories I heard, this was before the war started and before 1941, but after 39, and before the Lend-Lease program, that apparently there was a process where they would fly new planes to the Holton Air Force Base, and then they would attach them to a vehicle, and they would drive them across or pull them across the border to Canada, repaint them with RAF insignia, and have an RAF flyer there, and who flew them off, so that we were giving airplanes to the war effort even before the government officially entered the war, because it was very controversial. So there's lots of little stories like that that may or may not be true, but ought to be.
Ought to be. So were prisoners in other states as well integrated and accommodating as in Maine?
I've not studied that, but I've heard lots and lots of stories from people who've seen this program talking about what they know in their home state. And it certainly sounds like and certainly if you look at the artwork collections are amazing. And so you certainly think that they were busy and they were taken care of in similar ways. It was the government, so they didn't do it differently in Maine than they did it in Texas, really. They were in charge of the whole deal.
Looking at the time, I think that we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. Does that work for you, David?
Yeah, of course.
Great. Okay. How about you talked about there was a threat of escapees being sent to Russia. Did that ever happen, or were there other punishments?
Oh no, it was absurd. It was absurd. The idea that they would take the time to fly a group of guys. Well, first of all, in 1944, we hated the Russians and they hated us. And so there were all these, there's all these stories of these great races to try to get to a certain place before the Russians get there or whatever. And so in Germany, and so they wouldn't have taken anywhere. That was just, they were telling them whatever they needed to tell them to get them to not try to escape. But mostly it was, I don't know. If I was up there now, even now, with all the roads and all the other stuff, I don't know, you want to be tromping around the woods in Augusta County and where you don't know anything and you don't speak the language.
Right. Well, so maybe for our last question, someone wants to know if there's an available list of American military guards who served at the German POW camps in Maine. If they want to do.
If there is, well, there is a list like you think a list would exist, there is not, I suspect. But if you want to spend, you could hire somebody and probably spend, a few $1,000s having a researcher at the United States Archives, because this is where all of this material is in the National Archives, and they could look at the daily roll or the information about each camp and find probably most of the names of the guards at those camps, and then they could make such a list. But that doesn't exist, and finding anything at the archives, you have to really know what you're doing. It's hard, and I'm not an archivist in any way, shape, or form, but there's people you can hire to do that work.
Well, thank you for all the work you've done on this. This is
Oh yeah, it's been fun.
It sounds like you've done a lot of research.
Well, it's just sort of come along this way, and it's been a real blast. It's been so interesting, and it keeps on sort of poking up. And
What brought you to the story initially?
I first came to Maine in 1985 with a group of friends, and we started a touring theater company. And one of our goals was to tour to little places and perform in, ironically, Shannon, a whole lot of Grange halls around the Maine state.
Oh, okay.
And we were in Jackman, and I heard about the story of the camp in Jackman. At the time, the directions, and these are the same directions I followed to get there, was that you drove 12 miles south of Jackman, and then you turned right on the dirt road, and you drove 8 miles to the dirt road, and you looked for the tree with the mark on it and pulled in there, and that's where the camp was. And that's actually what was true.
Wow, so lucky for us.
I don't know how you find it from the south, but that's how you find it from Jackman.
And someone is asking, will they be able to watch this online? And yes, Shannon will be sending out a link to this presentation so they can watch it all again and share it with all their friends.
Yeah, in
Yes,
the online version, I'm much better looking.
I also got a message from one person who said that their internet was in and out, and if anyone on this talk was having that experience, then I hope you'll have a chance to tune in and watch the full recording so you can see whatever you missed. David, do you have any closing messages? Or
No, I'm so grateful for you to invite me, and I think it's great that so many people are attending your programs. I'm really delighted by that. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. We are very, very grateful that you came. I'm very happy to host you, and that this was very interesting. Thank you. And thank you to everyone out there in the audience tonight. I hope that we all connect again soon.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Have a good night.
Same to you.